In the autumn of 1800, Lord Cornwallis posed the chilling question: what then have we done? We have united ourselves to a people whom we ought in policy to have destroyed. Now, what did Cornwallis mean by that? He didn't really mean that they should have destroyed the Catholics in Ireland. He didn't mean that they should have sent the army in and killed them all. He was the great friend and supporter of the Catholics and emancipation. What he meant was that if the government brought in the Union, which they had passed, but did not follow it up with emancipation, then that betrayal would alienate the Catholics forever. And in that case, they might as well have just gone in and murdered all of the Catholics. His chilling sentence was a warning to the British: you must honour your promises. The problem is that Pitt, the Prime Minister, hadn't really put down the groundwork with the King. The King, George III, was vehemently against Catholic emancipation. In the summer of 1800, he turned to one of the cabinet ministers and he said, "I am glad for this Irish Union, because it will remove forever any hope of giving emancipation to the Catholics. What? And that's always the way he talked. What? And so that allowed the enemies of Pitt, the people who thought after 17 years it was time for a change of government, to go behind his back and go to the King and tell him about what Castlereagh and Cornwallis had been planning. That union was going to be accompanied by emancipation, and that although no direct promises had been made to the Catholics, that this had been understood. And the King was furious. Now, the Union came into effect on the 1st of January 1801, and the new united Parliament of Britain and Ireland met at the end of that month. And the day before, there was a royal court, a meeting of all of the dignitaries, and Lord Castlereagh was there, along with Henry Dundas, one of the key government ministers. And as soon as the King saw Dundas, he went up to him and he said, "What is this Catholic emancipation which this young Irish lord," pointing at Castlereagh, "is trying to bring in over my head? I tell you, I will consider every man my personal enemy who proposes such a policy to me." Now, as soon as Pitt heard this, it was terrible. Because now he realised it was out in the open. Now, you could blame Pitt for not having done more to talk to the King beforehand, but Pitt had his own problems. His health collapsed in the autumn of 1800. It was said that he wasn't even able to bring a pint of beer to his mouth without his hand shaking so much that it all spilt. The war with France was also not going well. There were food shortages in England caused by a drought that summer, and the accumulation of all of these problems meant that Pitt, after 17 years of being Prime Minister, was wearing out physically and emotionally, that he was not equipped to deal with this added pressure. And so he brought his cabinet together to try and discuss this matter, and he tried to get their majority support for emancipation. And although he got a majority of the ministers behind him, 6-5, that wasn't the overwhelming unanimity that he had wanted to try and convince the King. And in fact, one of them, Lord Camden, was only doing it, even though he was against emancipation, because he didn't want to embarrass his nephew Castlereagh or his great friend Pitt. So effectively, they didn't have a majority. Pitt realised he would have to discuss this with the King. And he wrote the King a very strong letter at the end of January, where he made it clear that if the King did not back him on this issue, he would have to resign. And in it he explained why he thought emancipation was necessary. He said, 100 years ago, you could understand why there were laws against the Catholics. That back then, you could tell whether someone was loyal or not by their religion. If they were Catholic, we couldn't trust them. If they were Protestant, they were loyal. But Pitt said the French Revolution has changed all of that. Because now you can be a Jacobin and a Catholic, or you can be a loyalist and a Catholic. You can be a supporter of the French Revolution and a Protestant. You can be opponent of the French Revolution and a Protestant. So let's not have an oath of allegiance based on religion. Let's have an oath of allegiance based on loyalty to the crown. And that's the way we separate the traitors from the loyalists. And it was a brilliant argument. and it was perfectly legitimate and perfectly valid. But the king would not hear any of it. The king had sworn a coronation oath that he would uphold the Protestant faith, and he was determined not to betray that oath. And he made it clear that he would rather have Pitt out of power than betray his oath. And the resignation of Pitt followed soon after. Although, and I've written about that, but the more I think about it, the more I think it wasn't really a resignation. It was as much a dismissal. It was as much the king firing Pitt as it was Pitt honourably resigning. Pitt believed that as a gentleman, he wouldn't, as an effective prime minister, he couldn't be curtailed by what he could propose by the king. Otherwise, the king would be controlling everything, and the cabinet and the prime minister would have no power. So Pitt was defending his conception of the role of prime minister as much as he was the negotiations that had taken place to pass the union. So despite Pitt's brilliant arguments, he was forced out of office. He resigned, Dundas resigned, Grenville, the foreign secretary, resigned, and a new government was brought in under the Speaker of the British House of Commons, Henry Addington. In Ireland, Castlereagh and Cornwallis resigned, again in protest over the promises that they had made to the Catholic leaders. And then something strange happened. The king went mad again. He had recovered in 1789 from his previous bout of insanity, but all of the pressure of this emancipation debate went to his head. It unbalanced him. And he had an outbreak of that illness again in February 1801, where he began talking to a stable hand, saying, "How are you, my good boy?" And the boy goes, "I'm fine, your majesty." And he turned to him and he said, "Keep out the Pope." He began talking to a big oak tree that was at Buckingham Palace, and people realised this was wrong. They confronted him and he broke down in tears and he said, "I am mad, I'm quite mad, I can't deceive you." And he broke down in tears. And what that meant was that Pitt wasn't able to hand over his seals of office to Addington. So for a month you had actually two cabinets in place. Pitt was brokenhearted. He was being blamed for the illness by the king. The king turned to Pitt's brother and he said, "Tell your brother it's all his fault that I've gone mad again." And Pitt was in tears. And he went to the king and made a vow that he would never again raise the Catholic issue with him. After a couple of months, the king recovered. Addington took over as prime minister. Pitt went into opposition. And it looked like there the Union's story would end, except they had to complete the cover-up. They had to authorise all of the illegal payments that had been made in Ireland during the Union. And some of the illegal payments in that slush fund had come from the King's Civil List Act. The king got a certain amount of money from Ireland every year. It was £18,000 in 1800. But rather than sending the money over to the king, they'd kept it in Ireland and used it as part of the slush funds for bribes. Well, the king had to sign a receipt pretending he had received the £18,000. He also had to sign off on all of the other accounts. He had to sign off on all of the Union promises. But having recovered from his madness, he couldn't remember having authorised any of these things. And when he saw these accounts, he said, "I never approved this. I never received that £18,000. I think someone has embezzled this money. I think corrupt methods were used to pass the Act of Union, and I am going to go public and expose them." So all of the Union corruption, which the anti-Unionists had spoken about, Grattan had claimed that only 7 pro-Union MPs had not been bribed, and those had been vehemently denied by Castlereagh and the others. Now it looked like that this would be all exposed, but exposed by the one person who they would never have expected it from, and that was the king. And Castlereagh had a nervous breakdown, a complete mental collapse, because it looked like his promising career was about to be ended by the king. And Pitt had to actually arrange a private meeting with the king and explain to him that before his madness, the king had approved all of these measures, that certain dubious things had happened to pass the Union, but that the king had been aware of them all and he had approved them all. And so the king signed off on all of the fictitious receipts, and the Union cover-up was complete. John Foster later became an MP in the British House of Commons, and when he was going through the accounts, he became Irish Chancellor of the Exchequer. He came across some of these dodgy dealings and threatened to make them public, but instead the government bribed him off and pretty much gave him a free hand in Ireland, and thus ensured that he wouldn't do it. And in a way, he didn't want to make these dealings public anyway, because the Union had passed. It was unlikely to ever be overturned, and that's one of the ironies of the passing of the Union. So many of the people who made vocal speeches against the Union violent speeches against the Union, ended up becoming key people in the post-Union administration. William Plunkett, for example, was one of the most vehement opposition MPs. He gave a brilliant speech in 1799 where he said that he would be like the father of Hannibal. He would bring his children to the altar and swear them eternal defiance, that they would fight for all time against this measure if it passed. Well, afterwards he became Solicitor General, and when Robert Emmet led his rebellion in 1803, Plunkett was one of the people who prosecuted him. And people thought that was a bit funny, given that in 1799 and 1800, he had actually made speeches calling on people to rise up in rebellion like Emmet. But they kind of said, that was then, this is now. We're prepared to make these great speeches then, but we've all moved on. And even Grattan became an MP in the British House of Commons and continued his career there from 1805 on. Incidentally, when he made his maiden speech in 1805, Pitt by that time was back as Prime Minister. He would die the following year in 1806. But they all gathered to hear Grattan speak because they'd heard wonderful stories about his eloquence. But when he spoke, they didn't know whether to laugh or applaud, because they'd never seen such a harlequin delivery. Him on his tippy toes, his hands moving all around the place, the sentences that were more like poetry than prose. And they all turned to Pitt to see how he would respond. And Pitt began nodding his head and began clapping, and they all joined in. And Grattan's then his style of speaking. But it shows how the style of oratory in the British House of Commons was very different from the Irish one. And I think partly that was because the British Parliament had a lot of business to get through every day, whereas the Irish Parliament really didn't do that much, even after legislative independence. And therefore there was more time to have glorious bits of poetry, glorious rhetoric, beautiful sentences that you could prepare, because they really weren't going through the same amounts of legislation. But I just want to end by talking a little bit about the character of Pitt, because the resignation of Pitt in 1801 is considered one of the great mysteries of British politics. People can't really understand why he resigned when no open promises were ever made to the Catholics. But the reality is that there was an awful lot going on there. There was the entire basis of the Union settlement, the way they had got the Catholics on side. Lord Grenville, Pitt's cousin, who was the Foreign Secretary, said that he wouldn't be able to walk the streets as a gentleman if he carried on after all of that. But what the resignation of Pitt meant was that a anti-Catholic government took over under Henry Addington, and the Catholic question was taken off the table for decades. No government wanted to bring in emancipation. Henry Grattan in the British Parliament spoke about it. He was a lone voice. They knew the king was against it. And even when the king went mad again in the 1810s and a regency took over and the king never recovered, his son, the Prince Regent, later George IV, he was also against emancipation. So they knew there was this insurmountable obstacle that they could never overturn. And the fact that the Union hadn't been accompanied by emancipation meant that Catholic Ireland now felt betrayed. They had voted away their parliament and they had got nothing in return. They had got no rights. It was worse than before, because at least before, the Irish Parliament kind of listened to them sometimes. Now they had no say whatsoever. So they joined in feeling humiliated, like the Irish Protestants. Up until 1800, if you had asked many of the Protestants in the Irish Parliament, what do you mean by the Irish nation? They would have said, we mean the Irish Protestants. They would not have included the Irish Catholics within that nation. Tone challenged that. He wanted an Irish nation that was Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. But from 1800 on, you see that the Irish nation becomes closely identified with the Catholic majority, because the Catholics for the next 30 years had to fight for their political rights in campaigns that mobilised them in the 1820s. They had to campaign through Parliament. And that bringing together of the Catholics meant that they had to get, through agitation, what should have been given as a gift in 1801, as Pitt and Castlereagh and Cornwallis had wanted. And because it wasn't, because it had to be forced from the British government, it was never seen as something that was going to make them happy. They never felt part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which had been created. And because of that, Pitt's great vision of unifying Britain and Ireland into a unifying security mechanism had failed. His great vision for uniting Ireland and Britain as a unifying security mechanism was destroyed. It was stillborn. It had failed. And that failure would haunt Irish history for centuries.